Before the world had woken, before the crows cried over the chimney peaks and the fog dissolved along the cold of the pines, Mara had already stood barefoot in the dim hush of her kitchen, hands plunged into a basin of flour and water. The dough clung to her skin like memory, soft and stubborn, needing her warmth, her rhythm, her quiet grief. The fire in the stone oven behind her was low but steady. Fed through the night by kindling, she chopped herself with stiff fingers and an old axe that had belonged to her husband. She wore a wool shawl wrapped 3 times around her shoulders and a long brown dress that brushed the floor, its hem stained with ash, flour, and years. The same dress she had worn on the day she buried him, though she hadn't realized it until long after. Her life had become a circle of such unspoken repetitions. The bakery, such as it was, occupied the bottom floor of a squat, narrow building pressed between a shuttered post office and a sagging chapel with no bell. The sign above her crooked green door had long since faded. It once read Hearth and Crust, painted by her husband's hand with care and an amateur's flourish. Now it was only a ghost of letters, curling at the corners, half forgotten like the rest of the street. Wind swept leaves down the alley beside the bakery, where cats yowled and trash collected in corners. The town itself seemed caught in a kind of slumber, neither dying nor waking, just waiting for something that would never arrive. The only true sound in the hour before dawn was the rhythm of Mara's kneading, the steady thump of dough against wood, the hush of breath against fire. She didn't speak aloud anymore, not unless spoken to, and no one really did that. Customers came when they needed to, those who still remembered bread made with hands instead of machines, and they paid in coins or eggs or silence. Mara didn't mind. Silence had become a kind of language. It filled the space left by things that were never said. How the war had thinned the valley, how the river dried 2 summers ago and never returned, how the young left and the old endured, and everything else just withered between. In silence, she remembered the sound of her mother's voice reciting prayers while peeling potatoes, the way her sister had laughed once when they spilled molasses over the floor as girls, how her husband's breathing had slowed at the end like a fire losing its shape. There were names she no longer let herself say. There was love, still, but buried deep under routine and the weight of keeping on. Each morning she made 20 loaves, 5 of rye, 5 of barley, 5 of oat with honey and crushed apple if she had it, and 5 of plain white, for the old men with no teeth and the women whose children still lived on porridge. She wrapped each in linen and placed them on the shelves beneath the window, careful, as though laying them down to rest. There was pride in it still, though she told herself she baked only because she didn't know how to stop. Her hands would ache if they weren't in motion. Her heart would too. But there was something different in the air that morning. A stillness that was too sharp, too held. Mara noticed it when she stepped out the back door with a basket of scraps and caught sight of the alley. A boy stood there, no more than 8, thin as a twig, watching her with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with hope. He didn't speak, didn't move. His clothes hung in tatters, and his feet were wrapped in rags that had once been a blanket. She looked at him and felt something pulled tight inside her chest, not like fear, but something older, something with teeth. She turned without a word and went back inside. She did not offer him anything. She told herself it was not her place, that there were too many like him, that as she began to give, she would never stop, that the village council had warned against vagrancy, that the old women on the square whispered about thievery and disease, that kindness had become dangerous. She closed the shutters tighter and kept her eyes low. But the next morning, she rose before the sky had softened from black to blue, and before she lit the oven or stretched the first dough, she sliced a whole rye loaf, buttered it while it was still warm, and wrapped it in a linen square. She didn't speak while doing it. She didn't pray. She simply walked to the front of the bakery, placed a bundle on the outer sill beneath the cracked pane of glass, and walked away. No note, no explanation, no expectation. It was not charity. It was not hope. It was something quieter than both. She didn't wait to see if it was taken, though by the time she returned with the next batch of dough, the windowsill was empty. That night, she dreamt of her sister's hands, smaller than hers, callous from carrying water, always smelling of rosemary and milk. In the dream, her sister was younger than when she died. She was holding a loaf of bread and smiling, but her eyes were full of tears. Mara awoke with her mouth full of dust and didn't sleep again that night. From that day on, the windowsill became a quiet ritual. Some days she left half a loaf, some days a heel and a slice of hard cheese. Once, a whole apple. She never saw the children come, but she knew they were there. She began to recognize the signs, the faint scuff of footprints in the frost, the scrap of a red ribbon left behind, once a drawing tucked beneath the empty cloth. It was a shaky image, done in charcoal, of a woman with large hands and a child holding bread. She didn't keep it, but she didn't throw it away either. She tucked it beneath the flour sacks, where it would not be seen, but could not be forgotten. Soon the numbers grew. First 2 children, then 4, then a shifting group of 10 or more who came quietly at dawn or dusk, never speaking, never knocking. Mara never asked where they came from or where they went. Some were likely orphans, others runaways, others merely abandoned in spirit if not in law. The town looked the other way, as long as they stayed near her door and not theirs. She never made proclamations. She never called it a mission or a cause. She simply baked more, bought less for herself, sold what she could to buy flour in larger sacks, sometimes taking a long road to mill to avoid questions from the grocer. She never asked for thanks. She rarely received it. But one morning, nestled beside the folded linen of an emptied loaf, was a pine cone, small, brown, ordinary. She almost missed it. She picked it up and turned it in her hand, its scales dry and tight, the tips worn silver by cold. No note, no name, just a pine cone. She left it on the shelf above her hearth and tried not to wonder. The next day, there was another, and then another, each morning, as though an answer, as though the child or children understood that even in silence, something needed to be said. She didn't know why it moved or the way it did, why the pine cones made her throat tighten or her hands tremble just slightly as she placed the next loaf on the sill. But it became a quiet conversation, a trade, a rhythm, a life. The wind outside grew sharper with each passing week. Winter began to lay its fingers along the rooftops, white and final. The bread took longer to rise. The fire needed more wood. The ache in her back became constant, but she did not stop. She baked, she fed, she endured. And each night, before extinguishing the last candle, she looked toward the shelf above her hearth, where now a small row of pine cones sat like offerings, dry and brown and still. She never touched them. She never moved them. But she counted them sometimes, when the wind howled too loud and the silence grew too large. She did not know yet which of the children it was. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know that one of them would come to love her more fiercely than blood, more loyally than time. She did not yet know that the boy who left her pine cones would one day buy her a farm. All she knew then was the weight of bread in her hands, the whisper of fire behind her, and the quiet gift of a pine cone waiting at the sill. The snow came early that year, not in sweeping blizzards, but in slow, persistent flurries that clung to rooftops and doorframes like moss, quiet and unmoving. It dulled the village sounds, softened the world into a hush that never quite lifted, and buried everything in a shroud of white that made the bakery's chimney smoke the only visible sign of life on the street. Mara awoke each morning in the dimness before light, her breath missing the cold kitchen air before she even lit the oven. And as she prepared the first batch of dough, she began to notice a difference, the feeling that her work, once invisible, had begun to draw unseen eyes. At first, the evidence was small. 2 sets of footprints in the snow outside the windowsill instead of 1. Then 3, then a jumble of overlapping impressions, as though a crowd had gathered and scattered all at once. She didn't see them. She never did. But the food she left, half loaves, crusts, old fruit, disappeared faster, and the linen squares she used to wrap them began to vanish as well. She knew some of the children were wrapping themselves in them, wearing them as scarves, using them as bedding. She began to stitch old scraps of fabric together into rough bundles, wrapping the food in those instead, folding the corners carefully so they might serve as both sustenance and shelter. Word had spread, she realized, not through the adult channels of gossip and news, but through the quiet, invisible paths that children use. The glances passed across alleyways, the whispers in the schoolyard, the silent nods exchanged between those who had learned to survive by not being noticed. They had come to know her as the bread woman. And though she heard no thanks and saw no faces, the evidence of their gratitude revealed itself in small, peculiar offerings. The pine cones continued to appear, but now they were sometimes adorned. One dipped in wax, another tied with fraying red thread, another painted with soot into the shape of a face. There were bits of twine, acorns, even a single rusted key left once on top the sill. She did not know where they found these things, or why they chose to leave them, but she never threw them away. She placed each one on a narrow shelf above her hearth, the collection growing into a strange, beautiful altar of anonymous exchange. The townsfolk began to notice too, though not in the way Mara would have liked. It started with sideways glances in the grocer's queue, then furrowed brows and long pauses in conversation when she entered a room. One woman, the blacksmith's wife, muttered something about rats being drawn to food left outdoors, though her eyes made it clear she meant children. A shopkeeper once refused to sell her flour on credit, citing a new policy. She paid with a gold earring she hadn't worn in decades. A man she had once shared cider with after her husband's funeral told her she was making trouble where there wasn't any, and when she asked softly what kind of trouble he meant, he looked away and changed the subject. No one said it directly, but the disapproval hung in the air like smoke, subtle and suffocating. They saw the children as a problem. Feral things, burdens, proof of failure. Some of them were orphans of the war. Others were left behind by parents who went looking for work in cities or simply vanished. A few had families still in town, but those homes were cruel or drunk or indifferent. Mara understood what it meant to be left behind, to be overlooked. She knew how loss could make a person hollow in ways that never healed. But she also knew the small warmth that a crust of bread could bring. It was not much, not a solution, but it was a beginning, and some mornings that was enough. One by one, the children began to come closer, not to speak, not to knock, but to hover. She began to notice them in her periphery. Shadows moving along the edge of the alley, small figures darting from the corner of the chapel to the side of her building. One girl, no older than 7, with tangled yellow hair and 2 different boots, took to sitting across the street in the early hours, her breath curling in the cold, watching Mara's front door as if it were a stage and she, the only audience. Mara never addressed her. She simply added a little more food to the bundle and left it as usual. One morning, the girl was gone, and in her place was a folded note with only 3 words written in crooked letters. She found me. Mara wept quietly that night by the oven, pressing her hands to the warm stones as though the heat might pass into her chest and keep her whole. She never knew what happened to the girl, if someone had taken her in or taken her away. But the note remained with the pine cones and twine, a relic of a vanished soul. The hunger lines outside her bakery grew longer, not visible, not organized, but present in the invisible order things. Children began arriving earlier, waiting quietly in the snow, hiding behind crates and fence posts. Some of them began to leave small offerings of their own, an old button, a feather, a piece of blue glass. One child, likely no older than 10, began sweeping the walk in front of her shop before sunrise. She never saw him do it, but the sweep marks were clear, the snow cleared carefully away in a neat semicircle each morning. Eventually, she began leaving a crust and a piece of cloth by the broom. She started to recognize some of them by their posture, their gait, the shape of their footprints. One boy limped slightly on his left foot. One always wore a red cap with a hole at the crown. Another dragged a broken doll everywhere he went, its porcelain head cracked clean in half, but still tied with a yellow ribbon. They were children, yes, but shaped by harshness, by the ache of never enough, by the cold that wore into their bones and taught them to distrust warmth. She did not expect their gratitude, but sometimes, when she opened the door too quickly, she would catch a glimpse of them. The way their eyes lit on the bread, the way their hands trembled when they reached for it. That was enough. Once, near the end of the month, an older boy came during daylight. He was tall, maybe 12, and stared to the window with a hard set to his jaw. He wore a coat 2 sizes too small and stood in a posture that dared her to notice him. Mara stepped out without a word and handed him a full loaf of barley bread. Still warm, He didn't reach for it first, just looked at her with suspicion, then confusion, and then something quieter. She saw the moment when he softened, barely, but enough, and took the loaf without a thank you, retreating down the alley. Later that evening, she found a pine cone on her windowsill painted with ash and pressed with thumbprint at the base. By midwinter, the children had woven her into their world, not as a savior or a mother, but as a constant. She was the bakery woman, the silent one, the giver of bread. They never lingered. They never asked for more. They knew the limits of what was safe. But Mara had become, in some small way, their landmark, their refuge, their myth. There were rumors in the town now, murmurs in the general store about stolen loaves and ungrateful mouths. A councilwoman suggested Mara register her bakery formally or stop operating altogether. But no official action was taken, not yet. People were wary of her, but not brave enough to confront her directly. She carried with her the quiet power of a woman who had endured loss and never asked for anything in return. The kind of woman who could outlast cold stares and whispered judgment, who had buried enough love to know what mattered and what did not. And still, each morning, before the sun rose and the frost melted from the windows, she baked. Her hands moved through the motions of dough and fire and memory, guided by something deeper than duty, something closer to faith. She left the bread on the sill without fanfare, wrapped in cloth stitched from old skirts and fraying curtains, folded with care, offered like prayer. And each day they came, not with names, not with thanks, but with offerings of their own, small and strange and sacred in their quiet way. A drawing of a bird with a missing wing, a piece of ribbon that had once been green, a broken pocket watch that no longer ticked, and always, somewhere near the bundle, a pine cone. He came into her life without ceremony, without request, without explanation. One morning in late winter, as frost rimmed the bakery windows like lacework and the wind groaned through the alley behind the chapel, he was simply there, sitting on the overturned crate beside the back door, arms folded around his knees, chin resting on his sleeve. Mara saw him first through the wavering glass of the storeroom window, a blur of shadow and shape, and assumed it was one of the usual children, come early in hopes of extra crusts. But when she stepped outside with the morning scraps wrapped in cloth, he didn't flinch or retreat like the others. He looked straight at her, his face half shadowed by the hood of a coat too thin for the season, and waited. He was older than the rest, 10, perhaps 11, though his bones were sharp with hunger and his mouth pulled tight in a way that suggested years beyond that. His eyes were a strange kind of brown, the color of worn earth after rain, deep guarded and too still. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched her. Mara paused, her hand halfway outstretched with a bundle, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Then he rose, slow and deliberate, took the cloth from her fingers, and nodded once. It was not a gesture of thanks, but of agreement, as though acknowledging a contract neither of them had written. She watched him walk away, without turning his head. That night, she found a pine cone on the crate where he had been sitting. It was dusted with snow, its scales tight but dry. He returned the next day, and the day after that, always early, always silent, always sitting just outside the ring of warmth that the oven heat sent to the back door's thin wood. He never asked for more than what was offered, never begged, never lingered past the moment of exchange. He would rise, take what was given, nod, and disappear. Mara began to set aside a bit extra each morning, not out of charity, but out of a quiet recognition, a shared rhythm that neither of them broke. She did not ask him his name. She did not ask where he came from or where he went. He seemed like a child carved from winter itself, thin, pale, resilient, and impossible to bend. But one morning, as she was scattering ashes from the night's fire into the alley, she noticed something new. The crate he sat on had been swept clean of snow and soot. The dustbins beside the wall had been emptied, and the broken glass from the old window pane had been cleared and stacked neatly. It was small work, subtle, easy to miss, but it bore the unmistakable shape of intention. The boy was standing at the edge of the alley, his back to her, watching the smoke rise from the chimney with arms crossed. She said nothing, but the next morning, she left a broom by the door. It disappeared by mid-morning. That evening, the alley was swept clean. He became a fixture of the bakery after that, a silent hand that moved without prompting. He hauled water from the pump 2 streets away when the frost froze the pipes. He carried the heavy flour sacks up the back stairs without complaint. When the shutter on the storeroom window came loose during a storm, he climbed the eaves and nailed it down with practiced ease. Mara never saw him arrive or leave, only found the work done and the pine cone waiting somewhere new, on the shelf, on the oven ledge, tucked behind the flour tins. It became his mark, a kind of signature. He left no words, no questions, no name, but slowly, the space between them began to change. One day, she returned from the grocer to find him sitting inside the bakery, cross-legged on the floor beside the fire, peeling potatoes with the old paring knife she thought had gone missing months ago. He looked up when she entered, nodded once, and continued working. She didn't scold him. She didn't ask how he had gotten in. She simply stepped past him and set the flour down, noting with strange comfort that the hearth had already been swept and that a fresh bundle of kindling had been stacked in the corner. From then on, he came inside without waiting. She began setting out a second bowl at the work table. He never asked. She never told. Weeks passed like this, and she began to notice the small sounds of him. The way his breathing changed when he slept near the oven, slow and deep like a resting animal. The way his hands moved when shaping dough, careful, exact, mimicking her motions with startling precision. He watched her closely when she worked, his eyes tracking each movement, memorizing the process without speaking. She began to teach him, not through instruction, but through presence. She would hand him the bowl, gesture toward the flour, nudge his elbow when he overmixed or underfolded. He never spoke, but sometimes you would hear him humming softly under his breath, a broken rhythm without melody, as if the tune had been shattered and reassembled without care. One evening, after a long day of baking and repair, she found him curled in the woodshed behind the bakery, asleep on a pile of burlap sacks, a half-frozen stray dog nestled against his side. The dog was mangy, with one ear torn and a limp, but it pressed against the boy as if they were one creature. He had pulled a coat over both of them and wrapped a cracked basin of water in rags to keep it from freezing. Mara stood there for a long time, watching them to the half-open door, the light of her lantern casting long shadows over the straw. She did not wake him. Instead, she placed a folded blanket at the threshold and left without a word. He never thanked her, but he never left again. Not really. From that night on, he slept inside, first on the floor near the fire, then eventually in the attic above the bakery, where she had once stored spare linens and broken shelves. She cleared the space slowly, bringing up a mattress, a candle, an old chair. She never called it his room, but it became his. She began to say "we" when speaking of the bakery. She didn't notice at first. It slipped out of her mouth the way truth does when it's finally tired of waiting. It wasn't until the first bloom of spring that he finally spoke. She was stacking loaves on a window display, and he was sweeping ash from beneath the oven. Without looking up, he said, "You cut too deep." She turned, startled, unsure she had heard correctly. He nodded toward the loaves. "The crust cracks when you score like that. You're angry today." She didn't respond right away, stunned not only by the sound of his voice, but by the precision of his observation. He had noticed her mood in the bread, in the cuts she made with the blade. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to correct him, to embrace him. But instead, she returned to her work and replied quietly, "Yes, I am." He didn't speak again for several days, but after that, his words came in trickles, short sentences, observations, questions delivered without preamble. He asked about flour ratios, about yeast, about fire temperature. Then later, more dangerous questions. Why did the children leave? Why did no one help them? Why did the baker before her never give anything away? She answered what she could, and when she could not, she was silent. He did not seem to resent her silences. He simply stored the answers she gave and carried them like stones in his pocket. Eventually, she asked his name. It was late, and they were eating stew on the back step, the sky pale with the dust of sunset. He hesitated, then said, "Ivan." She repeated it softly, testing the sound. It felt solid, real, like a stone placed into her palm. He nodded, as though confirming a truth rather than sharing it. "Ivan," she said again, "it suits you." He didn't respond, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but something close. From then on, she called him by name. He never called her anything until one night, deep in summer, when thunder shook the walls and rain leaked through the cracked eaves. He was folding dough for the morning batch, sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with flour, when he glanced at her and said, "Ma." It was quick, unthinking, slipped out like breath. He froze afterward, eyes wide, as though the word had betrayed him. She did not react, did not speak. But later that night, after the storm had passed and the wind had gone still, she placed one more pine cone on the hearth. Just one, slightly larger than the rest. And though neither of them spoke of it again, it remained in the center of the shelf untouched, a small monument to something neither of them had dare hope for. The summer had arrived late and reluctantly, as if the season itself questioned whether it still belonged to the place that had forgotten how to bloom. The valley was green, yes, but thinly so, as though the color were painted over a deeper brittleness. The bakery's garden behind the alley yielded only bitter greens and a handful of stunted root vegetables. Rain had been scarce at spring, and the fields that bordered the outskirts of the village had begun to show the first signs of surrender. Pale wheat heads, earth split open in long, thirsty cracks. Even the birds seemed quieter that year, their songs short and uncertain in the early hours. But still, the oven in Mara's kitchen roared each dawn, and the scent of bread drifted to the cracked window panes like an answer to a question no one had dared to ask. Ivan had grown taller, and with the height came a lean sharpness that made him look older than his 15 years. His voice had begun to deepen, though he still spoke sparingly, each word chosen and measured like the ingredients in Mara's oat honey loaves. He moved through the bakery with confidence now, instinctively reaching for bowls and blades without instruction. He had memorized her timing, how long to let the dough rise depending on the weather, how to test the heat of the oven with his bare palm held just above the stone floor, how to adjust the salt when the flour came in heavier than usual. They worked often without speech, two bodies aligned by rhythm and memory, shaped by the same quiet insistence on routine. The children still came, though fewer now. Some had grown, moved on, faded into the pulse of the city or vanished into farms further inland. Others had been lost to winter or to hunger or to things unspoken. And though their faces no longer appeared at Mara's sill, their pine cones remained on the shelf above the hearth, a silent roll call of absences. But those who remained still lined up along the alley wall each morning, not in neat rows but in scattered clusters, cold fingers tucked into sleeves, eyes flicking toward the door with a reverence given to ritual. Mara never addressed him directly, but Ivan had begun to do so in his own way, passing out bundles without expression, nodding once to those who offered small gifts in return. He had started to teach one of the younger boys how to knead. Another, he showed how to tie bundles with strips of torn linen. Mara watched him from the doorway some mornings, her chest both heavy and full, as if the weight of what she had carried for so long had begun to shift its shape. But the town had grown restless. Whispers had become grumbles, and grumbles had grown teeth. It was not that they despised Mara outright. She had lived there long enough to be seen as something between a relic and a warning. But there was an unease that followed her now. Charity was viewed with suspicion. In times of lack, generosity read as defiance. And defiance, however quiet, was dangerous. One morning in mid-July, a letter arrived, folded in thirds and stamped with the dry emblem of the village council. It had no greeting, no softness, only a paragraph of legal language citing ordinance violations, improper distribution of goods, and unauthorized operations within a residential zone. There was a fine, a deadline, a warning. Mara read it twice at the table before handing it to Ivan, who scanned it without expression and then set it beside his plate. He didn't speak, but his jaw tightened and his hands curled slowly into fists. That evening, he repaired the shutters, scrubbed the floors, and checked the bakery's firebox 3 times before sleeping. The next day, the pine cone on the sill was split in half. They had 2 weeks to respond. Mara did not contest the letter. She had no legal grounds, no permit, no allies in the council. Her shop had always existed more in spirit than in regulation. It was not rebellion. It was necessity. and necessity did not often wear official stamps or formal addresses. Still, she tried. She visited the council office, waiting in a wooden chair beneath a flickering lantern while the clerk shuffled papers and avoided her eyes. When her name was finally called, she was ushered into a bare room with no windows, where a man she barely recognized read the letter aloud as if she hadn't already memorized every word. She asked for time. He said the decision had already been made. She asked for forgiveness of the fine. He said the bakery had failed its civic duty to report charitable distributions. She asked what harm she had caused. He did not answer. When she returned home that evening, the silence in the bakery felt thicker than flour dust. Ivan didn't ask what had been said. He could see it in her face. Instead, he stepped outside, where a group of the children had gathered early, as if they too had sensed a shift in the wind. He spoke to them, quietly, firmly, and though Mara could not hear the words, she could see the change in their bodies, the sudden urgency in their eyes. That night, for the first time, they stayed. Not all, but many. They sat outside the shop, beside the windows, beneath the overhang, along the edges of the alley, bundled in their makeshift blankets, humming tunes and sharing pieces of dry bread between them. A protest in silence, a vigil in hunger, a line of loyalty drawn with presence alone. It did not take long for the town to respond. By mid-morning, an argument broke out in front of the bakery. A shopkeeper shouted at one of the older girls, claiming she had stolen an apple. She had not. Mara stepped outside and offered to pay for it. The man cursed her. Later that afternoon, a rock shattered the bakery's front window. Mara was in the back when it happened. The glass exploded inward with a sound like ice breaking over deep water, scattering shards across the shelves, slicing through linen and crust alike. She found Ivan already sweeping the floor, his eyes unreadable, the broom handle gripped so tightly his knuckles blanched. She asked him if he had seen who did it. He didn't answer. But the next day, word spread that he had taken the blame. A constable came to the bakery that evening, hat in hand, voice low. He said that a boy matching Ivan's description had been seen throwing the stone, though there were no witnesses, no formal charges, only questions. Mara told him that Ivan had been inside with her, helping to bake, that he hadn't left her sight. The man nodded once, uneasily, and said the matter would be dropped. But the way he looked at her, pitying, condescending, stayed with her long after the door closed behind him. That night, Mara did not bake. It was the first time in over 20 years that the oven remained dark. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, the silence so thick it felt like a second skin. Ivan stood across from her, watching. He had a pine cone in his hand, unadorned, freshly fallen. He placed it gently on the table between them and said, "Let me fix this." His voice was quiet, raw with something she couldn't name. She shook her head. "This isn't yours to fix," she said. "It never was." He stared at her for a long time and then said, "But I owe you." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a boy but a beginning, a story still writing itself. "No," she said, "you don't owe me anything. But if you want to stay, then we keep baking. We just do it with the window boarded." He nodded once. That night, he hammered it across the shattered pane, measured and cut with care. The oven roared again before dawn, and when the children came in the morning, the bread was waiting for them, wrapped in scraps of old cloth, each bundle tied with string. Mara stood behind the counter with her apron dusted in flour, her hands steady, her face unreadable. The town did not approve, but they did not stop her either. Not yet. When asked why she continued, she did not answer with politics or principle. She said only they need it, and for Mara, that had always been reason enough. The first signs of the famine were so quiet they almost passed unnoticed, like a distant cough in the corner of a church, easy to ignore until it echoed to the rafters. It began with the flour, first the quality, then the weight. The sack she bought from the miller grew lighter, though the cost remained the same, and soon even those half-filled bags became harder to come by. When Mara pressed him gently one afternoon, the miller, a man she had known for years, whose wife once traded milk for barley loaves, looked at her with a kind of brittle apology and said simply, "It's the blight." She had heard the word before, muttered in anxious tones at the market, passed between farmers like bad luck or prayer. But now it felt real, stamped into her daily bread, written into the grain of her wood table. The wheat had turned early that year, blackening at the root, and the barley crop failed to ripen at all. The oats turned to husks. The rye twisted before it could be cut. Some blamed the soil, others the sky. But the truth settled into the bones of the village with a weight that could not be named. Hunger had always lived nearby, like a neighbor who kept to himself. But now he had moved in, setting up shop in every cupboard, in every glance, in every scrape of a spoon against an empty bowl. Mara adjusted quietly at first. She cut her recipes with acorn flour, grinding it herself with a stone pestle in the courtyard behind the bakery. The flavor was bitter, the texture coarse, but added weight, filled the bellies of children who had long since learned not to complain. She soaked hard grains overnight, extended rising times, stretched every batch until the dough thinned like skin over bone. She used the last of her sugar for one final batch of honey oat bread, and knew, as she watched it bake, that it would not come again that season. The firewood had to last longer too. Ivan began waking earlier, foraging for dry branches near the edge of the woods, collecting anything that might burn. He returned each morning with hands scratched and pockets full of pine cones, some saved for the hearth, others placed wordlessly on the shelf. The lines at the alley door lengthened. Children who had once appeared only on Sundays now came daily. Some brought siblings. Some brought nothing but open hands. Their faces were thinner, their cheeks hollowed, eyes rimmed with red. A boy who had once sung outside the bakery in a cracked soprano no longer made a sound, his throat dry from days without water. Mara took one look at him and gave him her own bread for the day. She drank only hot water that night, seasoned with rosemary and salt. Ivan protested, but she only shook her head. "I've eaten more than he has in his whole life," she said. "He'll remember this day." Each morning she stood by the oven before lighting the flame, hands on the stone, as if praying through warmth. She spoke not to God but to memory, to the idea of a world where children did not need to beg, where loss did not settle so easily into the marrow. She thought of her sister, who had starved in a camp long before this famine, who had written a final letter on a torn piece of cloth, sewn into the hem of a skirt. "Tell the wind we loved." It had read. She never showed Ivan that letter. She only folded it into a book of recipes and tucked it on the highest shelf. By late autumn, the famine could no longer be disguised. The market stood half empty. The butcher sold only broth bones, and even those were gone by noon. The dairy closed after losing its last cow. The fishmonger stopped arriving entirely. People grew gaunt and short-tempered. Fights broke out in the square. A woman was seen scraping lichen from the stones behind the chapel. Another tried to trade her wedding ring for a bag of flour and was turned away. Mara began to hear talk of rationing, of shutting down unregulated sources of distribution. Her name was not spoken aloud, but the implication hovered in the room like ash. She responded the only way she knew, by baking more. Ivan worked beside her until his fingers cracked and bled. He stitched his own gloves from scraps of leather and lined Mara's coat with wool from an old blanket. At night, when she was too tired to stand, he lifted her onto the kitchen chair and covered her with a shawl. He fed the fire. He checked the doors. He watched the sky like it might answer something, if only he looked long enough. Mara watched him too, in moments when he wasn't aware. How his shoulders had squared with purpose, how the softness of boyhood had receded from his jaw. He had grown into something beyond her, shaped not just by her hands, but by the ache of the world. Still he stayed. Still, he carried their shared silence like a torch. One evening, a girl no older than 5 collapsed in the snow just beyond the alley gate. Ivan saw her first, rushing to gather her into his arms. Her skin was cold, lips cracked and blue, breath shallow. Mara warmed a blanket by the fire, laid her gently on the rug, spooned warm milk between her teeth, drop by drop. She stayed up all night beside the girl, whispering songs from her childhood, songs she hadn't sung in decades. By morning, the girl's eyes opened. She asked if this was heaven. Mara smiled, not with joy, but with a grief so deep it had no bottom. "No, child," she said. But you're safe now. After that, word spread. More children came, some from other towns, walking barefoot through the cold. Some were brought by older siblings, cousins, neighbors too frail to care for them. Mara opened the attic. Ivan laid out extra mattresses on the floor. They gave up their own beds, slept in shifts, cooked soup from wild onions, dried mushrooms, anything that could be boiled into broth. A traveling merchant left behind a sack of lentils in exchange for half a loaf. Mara cried when she saw them, holding the grains in her hands like pearls. "We'll stretch it," she said. "We always do." But the strain grew visible. Her hands shook when she kneaded now, wrists stiff and swollen. Her back curved further each week, shoulders rounded from effort and cold. Ivan noticed but said nothing. Instead, he took on more of the labor, teaching the older boys how to mix and measure, assigning tasks to the girls who were strong enough to carry water or stack wood. He became their center, their guide, moving among them with quiet authority that neither demanded obedience nor courted praise. The children called him the oven boy in whispers, but some began to say sir. Mara overheard once and almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. It wasn't pride or sorrow. It was something heavier, a deep, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, one of them would live a life bigger than bread and hunger. Near the end of winter, Ivan disappeared for 2 days. Mara searched the paths, asked among the children, waited by the door through each night. On the third morning, he returned, cloak heavy with snow, eyes sunken from travel. He carried a sack of flour over one shoulder and a bottle of oil tucked beneath his coat. "Don't ask," he said when she met him at the door. It wasn't stolen. She didn't press him. She only placed a hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in months, let herself cry without hiding it. The famine did not end that year. It lingered, stretching itself in the spring like a shadow that refused to lift. But somehow they endured, not through miracle or magic, but through the dogged repetition of kindness, through the bitter crusts and broth-stained sleeves, through the warmth and oven that never quite cooled. Mara watched as the children slowly, haltingly, began to smile again. Not all, not always, but sometimes. Enough. She thought of Ivan often in those quiet hours, watching him teach a younger boy to score dough with a steady hand, the blade glinting in the morning light. He never called her mother. Not again, but in his care, in the way he shielded the children from the worst of it, in the way he placed each pine cone on the shelf as if it were a star he caught from the sky. She heard it. She felt it in the bread they shaped together. In the house they kept warm with their quiet, stubborn love. And even in the leanest week, when the last root had been boiled and the firewood nearly gone, the bakery stood, the oven glowed, and the bread, though thinner, though coarser, though smaller than before, still rose. It happened in the slow, subtle way that true turning points often do. Not as a great collapse or a dramatic fall, but as a gradual unraveling of ordinary strength. Mara had been weary for weeks, though she said nothing. The children still lined up before dawn. The oven still warmed the walls with its soft breath, and Ivan still moved through the bakery with the same quiet intensity that had marked his every motion for years. But her steps grew smaller. Her fingers, one so sure over the dough, trembled faintly as she pressed the heel of her hand into the flour. She dropped a bowl once, a simple ceramic thing she'd owned since the early years of marriage, and the shattering sound seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the walls of the bakery themselves understood that something precious had broken. At first, she dismissed the tightness in her chest as cold or exhaustion, or perhaps grief masquerading as something physical. Her breath came shorter by the hour. Her skin grew pale beneath the smudge of soot and flour. The children noticed, in the way children do, with sidelong glances and softer voices. One girl placed a clumsily drawn picture of Mara on the windowsill, all white hair and warm bread, and a halo of yellow sun behind her. Another boy brought her dried wildflowers wrapped in butcher paper. Mara smiled but said little. Even Ivan didn't ask, not at first. He had learned long ago that her pain was not the kind to be chased down with questions. Then one morning, as she was reaching for a sack of flour on the highest shelf, the world shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no cry, no collapse. She simply leaned too far, too quickly, and her knees buckled beneath her, with a kind of quiet betrayal. She hit the floor hard, the weight of her body landing against the wooden planks with a sound that silenced the entire bakery. Ivan was at her side in seconds, calling her name with a panic she hadn't heard in his voice since he was small. She tried to rise. Her legs would not obey. The breath in her lungs felt shallow, sharp, like wind rushing through a broken window pane. "I'm just tired," she whispered, the lye paper thin and brittle. Ivan didn't answer. He lifted her carefully, carried her to the cot in the storeroom, and covered her in blankets, his hands trembling as he tucked them in around her shoulders. She tried to protest, but her voice failed. A dry cough escaped her lips, and her eyes closed before she could stop them. That afternoon, Ivan left. He said nothing as he went. He took no bread, packed no satchel. He moved with the silence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Mara did not see him go, but one of the older girls watched from the alley and later whispered that he walked like a storm gathering itself, shoulders taut, head low, eyes fixed on a long road out of town. She didn't know where he went, only that he didn't return that night or the night after. Mara drifted in and out of sleep, her fever spiking with the dusk. She dreamed in fragments, her husband's hand brushing flour from her cheek, the sound of her sister's laughter down a hallway that no longer existed, the weight of a pine cone placed in her palm. The bakery held its breath. The children came still, out of habit or hope, lingering near the back steps with bread already missing from their hands. The oven remained cold. The kitchen, usually humming with motion, fell silent. Some of the older ones took it upon themselves to sweep the floor, to light the stove, to carry water. They whispered instructions to each other, mimicking Mara's movements from memory. One brave boy tried to mix dough, and though it did not rise, the effort hung in the air like incense. On the third day, just before dawn, the bakery door opened and Ivan stepped inside. His face was wind-burned and raw, his boots coated in dust. In his arms, he carried a stranger, a woman with skin dark as chestnut and eyes sharp with exhaustion. She wore a long coat of wool and carried a bag filled with glass bottles that clinked as she walked. Ivan did not speak. He led her to the storeroom and stood back. The woman crouched beside Mara, pulled back the blankets, and placed her hand to the old woman's brow. "You're late," Mara murmured, her voice hoarse but clear. The woman smiled without surprise. "And you're stubborn," she said. "That makes us even." Her name was Dr. Edna Meyer, a physician who had once studied in the capital but had since chosen the quieter life of rural practice. She was known in the outer villages, a kind of legend among those who lived too far from hospitals and too close to suffering. Ivan had found her 2 towns over, bartered with something he never explained, and convinced her to return with him in the middle of the night. It took them 2 days by cart, and she had arrived with the dust of another world on her boots. Dr. Meyer stayed for a week. She moved through the bakery with authority, issuing instructions, boiling water, mixing tinctures from herbs she carried in folded cloth. She placed cool rags on Mara's forehead, counted her pulse with the patience of someone who had seen worse, and still hoped for better. Ivan did everything she asked, gathering firewood, cleaning pots, running to the apothecary for supplies. The children watched from doorways, wide-eyed, uncertain whether to hope or fear. On the 5th night, Mara opened her eyes and found Ivan sitting beside her. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes held her steadily. "Did you pay her?" she asked. He nodded. "How?" she whispered. He hesitated, then said, "I gave her something I didn't need anymore." She frowned. "What was that?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, softly, "A promise I made to someone who didn't keep theirs." Mara closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "You shouldn't have," she murmured. "You shouldn't have given anything for me." But Ivan shook his head, and his voice was stronger now. "You gave everything for me. Every crust, every stitch, every day. Let me give something back." By the end of the week, Mara's fever broke. Her hands, still weak, could not lift the mixing bowl, but she could sit upright, speak clearly, laugh without coughing. Dr. Meyer packed her things without ceremony, accepted a small loaf of bread from one of the children as payment, and vanished as quietly as she had come. Mara asked Ivan once more what he had given her. He only said, "It doesn't matter anymore. She's gone and you're still here." For a time, Mara did not return to baking. She sat in the sun behind the bakery, wrapped in quilts, her hands resting in her lap like folded birds. The children came to sit near her, not to ask for bread, but just to be near the warmth of her presence. They brought her stories, stones they found by the creek, flowers pressed into pages. Ivan ran the bakery now, fully and without hesitation. He baked each loaf with the same care she had once taught him. Though his style was different, leaner, more precise, less instinctive perhaps, but no less full of care. He trained the older children to help, forming a small team that worked beside him in the early hours. He never raised his voice, never demanded. He asked, he showed. He led by doing. And in the attic, where the light streamed through a cracked window and dust floated like ash through air, he began to build something new. Shelves for extra food, cots for children who had nowhere to go, a ledger where he wrote names, not just those who needed help, but those who gave it. At the top of the page, in careful handwriting, he wrote, "Bread earned, not owed." One morning, after many weeks had passed, Mara stood without help. She walked to the bakery door, leaned against the frame, and watched as Ivan scored loaves on the table. The children moved around him like birds in flight, swift and coordinated, their movements shaped by rhythm and trust. Ivan looked up, saw her watching, and for the first time in years, he smiled fully. She felt in her chest, that old ache that had once been loneliness and now was something else entirely. Pride, belonging, a legacy passed without words. That night, she found something on her pillow, a pine cone, dry and painted gold, the edges dipped in ash. She picked it up with trembling fingers and held it to her heart, the weight of it both feather and stone. She did not weep. She only whispered his name into the stillness of the room, and in the quiet that followed, she felt unmistakably that her life had been answered. The years that followed moved like a river in slow thaw, still in places, almost unmoving, and then all at once the current would shift, carrying Mara forward whether she wished it or not. She had recovered from her illness, but not fully. Something had shifted in her body, a quiet weakness that lingered in her bones and joints, as though her strength had chosen not to return completely, as if some part of her had stayed behind in that fevered dream of half-light and pine-scented cloth. She rose later in the mornings now, no longer the first to the oven. She let the ache speak. She did not resist them. Ivan had taken over the rhythm of the bakery, and though his hands lacked the instinctual intuition she had once carried like second nature, he had grown into his role with a kind of purpose that neither asked nor waited for permission. He did not seek praise. He only worked, and in that steadiness, Mara began to understand what it meant to hand over the world she had built. The bakery continued, not as it once had, no longer the frantic, urgent lifeline in a time of famine, but as a quieter, steadier presence in the village. The hunger was not gone, but it no longer howled. It whispered now, softer, less often. The lines at the alley door grew thinner. The smallest children grew taller. Some no longer needed the bread at all. They came less frequently, and when they did, they left coins instead of pine cones, and sometimes brought their younger siblings to show them where the bread woman lived. The bakery became a kind of memory in motion, a place people spoke of in past tense, even while it still existed. Mara noticed the way the town had changed, slowly, subtly, as towns do when no one is watching. A new fence had been built around the chapel garden. The grocer hired a new assistant, a young woman from 2 towns over who had never known the winters Mara remembered. A family from the city moved into one of the empty houses on the north end, their children dressed in neat coats, their voices bright and unafraid. The air smelled different too, less of coal smoke and wet wool, more of rain and stone, and the coming of spring. But with the change came distance. The village no longer watched the bakery with suspicion, but with something quieter, forgetting. There was no malice in it, only the passing of time. And Mara, once the subject of whispers and warnings, now became something closer to legend, a story told to wide-eyed children about the woman who had fed the hungry and lit her oven in the coldest year. Her movements slowed. Her body, once held together by stubbornness and fire, began to yield. Her hands, which had once shaped loaves by touch alone, now trembled slightly when she poured tea. The stairs to the attic became a mountain she climbed only with care. Her days stretched into softer shapes. Mornings spent sitting by the window with a shawl draped around her shoulders. Afternoons spent shelling dried peas or sorting cloth into neat bundles. Evenings by the fire, her gaze drifting toward a shelf of pine cones that had grown into a forest. She no longer counted them, no longer traced their edges. She simply let them be, the memory of every hand that had once left them there resting quietly in her breath. Ivan visited often, but not always. He had begun traveling, first to the neighboring village, then farther still. There were whispers that he had started something, a new place, something with walls and a roof and beds that children could call their own. Mara did not ask questions. She did not need to. She saw in his eyes when he returned, the knowledge of weight, the burden of choice, the way a man carries responsibility not because he must but because he cannot look away. He brought stories with him, though he told them sparingly. A girl who had learned to read and now ran her own classroom. A boy who had grown tall and joined a building crew. A child once mute, now leading morning songs. "They're learning to live," he told her once, his voice so soft she barely heard it. Not just survive. He never stayed long. There was always something pulling him onward. A new place to visit, a shipment to arrange, a letter to deliver. But he always returned with something small, lavender soap, a spool of green thread, dried figs and wax paper. He placed them in her hands without flourish, and she accepted them the same way. Once, he brought her a small jar of honey. "From the eastern grove," he said. "They are bees again." She held the jar like a treasure, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Life, beginning again in places that once knew only hunger. The bakery no longer opened daily. Some weeks, not at all. Mara baked for herself now, and for the few who still came not because they had to, but because it felt right. A woman arrived with her daughter one morning, both wearing soft shoes and well-mended coats. The woman had once stood in line as a girl, silent and barefoot in the snow. Now she held her child's hand and introduced her to the bread woman as if meeting a saint. Mara offered them warm slices and tea and listened as the little girl talked about her school and her books and how she wanted to learn to bake too. When they left, Mara stood in the doorway for a long time, watching their figures disappear into the morning light, her chest aching with a kind of joy too deep for words. Sometimes men would come in uniform, quiet and gray-eyed, and leave folded bills on the counter without speaking. She recognized them by posture, not by face. Boys who had once stolen buttons and broken apples, now returned in clean coats with strong hands. They rarely spoke, but always they left something behind. A pine cone, a note, a ribbon, a feather. The old symbols returned now not as desperate tokens, but as sacred acknowledgments, proof that they remembered. The seasons passed without hurry. Summer folded into autumn, and with it, the smell of cider and wood smoke returned to the valley. Mara planted tulips outside the bakery in shallow beds, though she knew she might not see them bloom. She collected rainwater in a cracked basin and watched the sky with a kind of reverence she had never possessed in youth. Time did not frighten her anymore. She no longer fought it. She welcomed it, slow and whole and true. She wrote letters she never sent, to her sister, to her mother, to the children who had never returned. She tucked them into a drawer beside the oven, wrapped in a red ribbon, sealed with wax. She did not expect anyone to read them, but she wanted them written. She wanted the words to exist, like loaves baked even when no one is hungry, because the act itself mattered. At night, she sat in the old rocking chair by the fire, the floor beneath her softened by years of footsteps, and listened to the wind. It whispered sometimes, not the past, but the living. Laughter down the street, a cart rolling over stones, the creak of the chapel's front gate. The world had not become perfect, but it had become something that could hold both sorrow and beauty in the same breath. And each winter, when the first frost silvered the windows and the air tasted of smoke and iron, someone, never seen, never named, left a single pine cone on her doorstep, always dry, always placed with care. Mara would bend slowly to pick it up, hold it in her hand, press it against her chest, and close her eyes. Not in grief, but in memory, in gratitude. She never asked who left them. She did not need to. Some stories didn't require explanation. Some bonds never broke. Even as time wove them into quieter shapes, the oven still stood, the hearth still glowed, and Mara, slower now, smaller in body but vast in presence, remained in the center of it all, not as a keeper of bread, but as a keeper of meaning. The legacy had shifted hands, but it had not ended. It had rippled outward, taken root in places she would never see, in lives she would never meet. She did not need to witness it. She had felt it in the quiet. Each pine cone, each returning face, each breath of warm dough rise in the morning light. It was enough. It had always been enough. Her 70th birthday passed without celebration. Mara neither marked it with candles nor mentioned it aloud. She had never clung to numbers, not when years were measured in loaves, in children fed, in winter survived. The morning arrived like any other. Gray sky hanging low over the village, wind pushing through the alley in short, sighing gusts and a quiet ache in her knees that told her the weather would turn before evening. She rose slowly, wrapped her shawl tight, lit the oven more out of ritual than need, and watched the flame catch. The bakery had become more memory than motion, the scent of yeast and ash lingering even when no bread rose on the shelves. She moved through the morning in silence, hands brushing against the familiar. A chipped mug, the worn banister, the uneven dip in the floor just before the door. And she felt no urgency, no anticipation, only the steadiness of habit, as comfortable as it was lonely. It was only when she returned from sweeping the front steps that she noticed the envelope, thin and pale, slipped beneath the door like a breath. There was no stamp, no seal, only her name written in a hand she recognized without understanding why. Not bold, not decorative. Plain, practical, every letter formed with care, as though the writer feared being misunderstood. She opened it slowly, half expecting it to vanish in her hands, as dreams sometimes did. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a hand-drawn map. No greeting, no explanation. Just an inked road twisting through familiar landmarks. The crooked river bend, the old sycamore stump, the broken fence beyond the mill. And at the edge of the page, where the lines met the horizon, a circle drawn in soft graphite. Next to it, in smaller script, come. She stared at the word for a long time, as if it might rearrange itself into something clearer. But it didn't. It only remained what it was. Simple, undemanding, an invitation stripped of ornament. She folded the map into her apron pocket, not knowing what she would do with it. Part of her assumed it was a mistake, a trick of memory, or perhaps a forgotten errand from a time when she still kept lists. She made tea. She watched the street. She did not speak. Just after noon, a knock came, not the hesitant tap of a child or the heavy fist of the constable. It was measured, calm. When she opened the door, she found him standing there, not as she remembered him, but as he had become. Ivan, taller, broader, his coat lined with fur, his boots thick with the dust of travel. His face was leaner, more weathered, the curve of his jaw etched with lines that had not been there the last time he stood in her doorway. His eyes, though those deep, unwavering eyes, had not changed. He removed his hat, held it against his chest, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I thought I might take you for a ride," he said at last, voice low and even, the weathers holding. She narrowed her eyes, not in suspicion, but in the way one squints at light after too long in darkness. A ride where? He reached into his coat and unfolded a second map, identical to the one she had received. "You got this, didn't you?" She nodded, slowly. "I did." "Then you'll understand when we get there." There was no pleading in his voice, no urgency, only certainty. He did not press. He simply waited. She looked past him, down the narrow road, to where a wagon sat hitched to a broad-shouldered mule. It was plain but well-maintained, with blankets folded neatly in the back and a flask tied to the rail. She turned back to him and said, "Give me a moment." She packed nothing, only her shawl, the pine cone from her bedside shelf, and a small cloth-wrapped bundle of bread. She locked the bakery door not because she feared theft, but because she needed to complete the gesture. She had locked that door every day for 40 years. This day would be no different. Ivan helped her into the wagon with a gentleness that made her throat ache, and they set off down the road, the mule's hooves tapping a steady rhythm over stone and soil. They did not speak for the first hour. The air smelled of late autumn, smoke, damp leaves, and the last breath of ripening apples. Fields stretched wide on either side, golden and low, framed by the rise of distant hills. She watched the trees pass, each one familiar, yet distant in a way that made them feel slightly unreal, as if she were passing to the pages of a book she had once memorized or forgotten how to interpret. The map, she realized, had been unnecessary. Ivan knew every turn by heart. When they reached the hilltop, he slowed the mule and gestured forward. "There," he said. "Look." Below them, past a wooden fence that cut to the land in gentle arcs, stood a house. Not grand, not showy, but strong. A broad roof of weathered slate, walls of pale stone and timber, wide windows that reflected the clouds above. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of baking bread, real bread, rose faintly into the wind. A barn stood a short distance away, red and tall, with 2 goats grazing lazily nearby. Chickens pecked in the dirt. An orchard sprawled behind the house. Rows of trees spaced carefully, their leaves beginning to shift into gold. She stared, her breath caught halfway between exhale and disbelief. "It's yours," he said. "Everything you see. The land, the house, the orchard, the oven inside that kitchen. I built it for you." She turned slowly toward him, her eyes wide, unblinking. "You built this?" He nodded. "With the money from the foundation, with help from some of the children. Not children anymore. They're tradesmen now, farmers, carpenters. One of them even draws blueprints. We made it from what you taught us, from what you left behind." She looked back at the house, the way it sat into the earth as though it had always belonged there. "Why now?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I wanted you to live where the world doesn't ask anything from you anymore, where you can rest, where you can bake only when you want to, where the bread is just bread, not salvation." She felt something loosen in her chest, as though a string wound tight for decades had finally frayed. Her hands trembled. "I don't deserve this." He turned to her, voice firm, almost stern. "You do. You gave your life to everyone else. Let someone give you something in return." She closed her eyes. The wind pressed against her shawl, carrying the scent of earth and flower and time. When she opened them, she saw the path leading down toward the porch, a rocking chair waiting beside the door, the swing she had once dreamed of now built into the frame. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Ivan helped her down, guided her steps with the same care he had used to carry buckets in the early days. And when they reached the porch, he handed her the key. Inside, the house was warm. The oven glowed. The shelves were stocked with flour and preserves. A kettle hummed softly on the stove. The walls were lined with simple things: a row of hooks for coats, a woven rug, a painting of a pine tree on the far wall. A table sat near the hearth with 2 chairs. And on the mantel above the fire, there was a shelf, freshly made, with a single pine cone resting in the center. She reached for it slowly, her fingers curling around it like they had so many times before. And then she sat, and she wept, not with sorrow, but with the kind of release that only comes when something once lost has been returned without warning. Ivan knelt beside her and said nothing. He simply stayed, his hand resting lightly over hers, the fire casting soft shadows over the walls they now shared. That night, as the wind settled and the stars gathered above the orchard, Mara slept in a bed that had been built with her in mind, wrapped in a quilt stitched from pieces of the bakery's curtains, the pine cone beside her on the table. And in her sleep, she dreamed not of loss or cold or lines of hungry children, but fields blooming in the sun and the scent of bread rising in an oven that no longer asked her for anything but memory. The farmhouse settled into Mara's life as gently as a hand placed on the back of her shoulder, firm, quiet, unmistakably present. It did not ask her to change. It did not rush her. It simply waited, patient as tilled soil under the watch of sky. At first, she wandered through its rooms with a strange hesitancy. her steps muffled on floors that didn't creak beneath her weight, her fingers brushing walls not yet etched with her habits. The windows were large and clean, the air warm from a fire that seemed to know when to feed itself. She found the stillness disorienting, like waking in a room where the clock no longer ticked. There were no children crowding the door, no loaves needing to be pulled from a hearth before they burned, no lines waiting in the alley with empty hands. She had spent a lifetime responding to need, and now the silence left a hollow she could not quite name. The land outside shifted with the seasons, but never harshly. The orchard bloomed as if in recognition of her presence, pear blossoms softening the view beyond the kitchen. Each tree arranged with care and space between their limbs like a quiet chorus lined up to sing her home. The chickens wandered freely, unbothered and full of purpose, and each morning she collected their eggs with a small basket made of twisted reeds, the rhythm of that act beginning to replace the movements she once made at the bakery. There was wheat too, not much, but enough to fill her palms with kernels each autumn, enough to grind with a hand mill and feel the ache in her shoulders again, the good kind of ache, the kind that reminded her of living. She did not return to baking out of necessity, but habit. The oven built into the farmhouse kitchen had been designed with her in mind. Stone-lined, wide-mouthed, the wood drawer perfectly positioned to spare her knees from the bending. It remembered heat in a way that comforted her, radiating warmth even when the fire had died. On slow afternoons, she found herself preparing dough without thought, her hands moving with an old familiarity that neither time nor absence had erased. She baked not to feed, but to remember. She braided loaves and sliced apples into thin spirals, tucking them into sweet rolls like hidden poems. She baked shortbreads for the workers who came to prune the orchard and spiced rye for the postwoman who left notes at her gate but never came to the door. Ivan visited as often as he could, though less than she would have liked. His life had widened into something larger than she could have imagined. He now moved between towns and villages with the weight of purpose. His name spoken by people who had never met her. His days filled with letters, plans, construction, and stories of children who were no longer children, but still carried pieces of bread-warm memory in their chest pockets like coins. When he came, he brought news of a new shelter open near the southern bend, of a reading program started in the hills, of a girl who was once sickly now teaching 3 languages to a class of 20. He sat at her kitchen table and ate whatever she had made, even if it was cold or imperfect, and always thanked her with a quiet gravity that made her throat ache. He never stayed longer than a day or two. The world pulled at him with quiet hands, and she did not stop him. She had let him go once, when he was still more boy than man, and now she let him return to that greater calling with a kind of bittersweet pride. But she watched him ride away each time with a deepening stillness inside her, aware that each goodbye was stitched tighter with time. She wrote letters in the evenings, some addressed to no one, some addressed to herself, folded into the pages of old books and recipe journals. She read them aloud in the empty kitchen, her voice steady, low, unashamed. They were not records or confessions. They were acknowledgments of moments, of faces, of truths too small to name when they were happening. She remembered the names of children she hadn't seen in decades. She listed the types of bread she had made during the famine, and the ways hunger made people either cruel or kind. She recorded what it felt like the first time someone called her Ma, and how she had held that syllable inside her mouth for days like a seed not yet planted. The porch became her favorite place. Ivan had built it wide, with a railing shaped from branches smoothed by hand, and a swing that hung from iron hooks, wrapped in rope. She sat there most evenings with shawl across her knees and a mug of tea cooling beside her, watching the light shift across the orchard, listening to the wind threading through the wheat fields like fingers through hair. The quiet here was different than the quiet in the bakery. It had no waiting in it, no longing. It was full, like a bowl that had finally been filled after years of scraping its bottom. She did not feel forgotten. The world had not cast her aside. It had simply changed shape around her, and she had changed shape within it. People came sometimes, always quietly, always with kind of reverence. A young woman once walked up the hill with a dog at her side and asked if this was the place the bread woman had gone. Mara smiled and invited her to sit. They spoke for hours, and when the woman left, she placed a feather in the bowl near the door. A man arrived one rainy afternoon with 2 boys clinging to his coat and said only, "Thank you. I learned from you." She gave him 3 loaves and sent them off with soup in a tin. No names were needed. And sometimes, not often, but always meaningfully, Ivan would return with a gift not from a store or a cart, but from a life he'd helped build. Letters from children he once swept flour with, sketches of bakeries in new towns, journals with entries that mentioned kindness learned on a winter morning long ago. He would place them on her table, watch her read them with wet eyes, and say nothing. Their silence was a language of people who had walked through fire together and learned not to name the burn. The land gave back to her in slow, generous cycles. Apples fattened each year. The wheat grew more golden. The hens laid steadily. She planted herbs in narrow rows, thyme, rosemary, sage, and tended them as she once tended the children who lined her doorway. With care, without expectation. She moved slower, but with purpose. Her hair whitened fully. Her hands curled slightly at the knuckles, and her breathing grew shallow on certain cold days. But she never felt weak, only aged. And aging, she found, was not a burden but a kind of offering, proof that she had endured, and more than that, that she had mattered. One evening, as autumn bent the trees into fire-colored silhouettes and the wind carried the scent of smoke and damp hay, she sat on the porch and held a fresh pine cone in her lap. It had been left on the windowsill that morning, placed with care, as it always was when winter neared. She had stopped questioning who brought it. She had stopped wondering whether it was Ivan or someone he had asked. The truth of it was simpler. It arrived, always dry, always warm from someone's pocket, always waiting when the frost came. She turned it slowly in her hands, felt the ridges of it, the small sharp tips, the familiar weight. It was not just a gift. It was a thread, a way of saying, you are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are the root of something still growing. That night, she placed it on the mantel beside the others. The shelf was full now. Each pine cone a year, a story, a hand that once reached for hers without needing anything in return. She sat by the fire with a quilt over her knees, the light flickering over the pages of her journal, and wrote only one sentence. I was needed, and that was enough. She fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees, and in her dreams, the bread rose, the oven hummed, and a boy stood beside her with flour on his face and a pine cone in his palm, smiling with the quiet joy of someone who had come home. She died in the early hours of the morning, before the sun had gathered enough courage to cross the ridge, before the wind stirred the orchard leaves or the rooster found his voice. The room was still, as it had always been at that hour, the fire in the hearth long since reduced to a hush of embers, and a draft moving gently through the open window, soft as breath. Mara lay beneath a quilt she had stitched in her younger years, the seams frayed in places but holding strong, as all well-used things do. Her hands were folded neatly over her chest, fingers intertwined as though she had simply paused between movements. The pine cone from the windowsill rested on the table beside her, its scales dry, tipped with frost from the night before. There was no struggle, no sound, only the quiet completion of a life that had given and finally been allowed to rest. It was Ivan who found her. He had returned late the night before, after traveling from a northern village where a new center had just opened. A place built of brick and oak, with high ceilings and long tables, designed not for rescue, but for dignity. He had meant to visit in the morning, to bring her a small jar of honey and a hand-drawn map of the new orchard the children had planted. Instead, when he entered the farmhouse just after dawn, he was met with the soft, undeniable stillness of something finished. He stood at the doorway of her room for a long time, the weight of the air settling around his shoulders like a shroud, and said nothing. There were no tears at first, only breath, only silence, only the realization that the person who had given him everything had finally laid it all down. The house did not feel empty, even then. It felt full in ways sacred places often do, quiet, reverent, changed. Ivan moved through its rooms slowly, lighting candles as he went, not out of necessity, but in gesture, in ritual. He prepared tea, placing 2 cups on the table out of habit, then letting one grow cold. He did not open the window further. He did not try to fix the stillness. He simply sat with it, allowed it to be what it was, and waited for the light to come to the curtains on its own. Word spread slowly. There was no announcement, no bell rung, no obituary printed in a paper. Only the gentle murmur of loss passed between mouths that once knew hunger and hands that once held bread. Former children, now grown and scattered across counties, heard in time. Some arrived within days, others weeks. They came on foot by cart, in borrowed cars, and along paths worn thin by memory. Each brought something with them: a note, a stone, a drawing, a ribbon, a baked good with an uneven crust. One woman carried a satchel full of pine cones she collected over the years, each wrapped in paper with a date and place written in delicate script. Another brought a jar of ash from the old oven that had long since collapsed into ruin, preserved as if it were a relic. They buried Mara beneath the oldest pine on the farm, a towering tree whose branches curled protectively over the slope beyond the orchard, its roots deep in soil she had once walked every morning. There was no headstone, only a small, smooth stone placed at the base of the trunk, etched not with her name, but with the word enough. Ivan placed it himself, his hand firm, his breath steady, and when he stood, he looked at the sky and whispered something only he heard. Near the grave, he built a small oven from stone and mortar. It was not large, just wide enough for a few loaves, its chimney low and squat, the arch above its mouth carved with her initials and a small pine cone at the center. He did not build it for ceremony. He built it for use, for memory made tangible, for warmth that could still rise. Each week, he returned to that place and baked. No set schedule, no invitation. He would light the fire before sunrise, knead the dough as the mist lifted from the trees, and shape the loaves with the same care she had once taught him. Not rushed, not precise, but present. When they were done, he left them on a stone ledge beside the oven, wrapped in cloth, marked with charcoal drawings of leaves, feathers, or stars. Children began to come again, drawn not by hunger, but by story. Their parents spoke of the bread woman and the oven boy, of winter survived in kindness that never asked for names. They approached the hill with caution at first, unsure whether the loaves were truly meant for them, whether the stories were more than legend. But Ivan was always there, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking in low tones that matched the way of the earth. He taught them what he knew, not just how to mix flour and water, but how to listen for silence, how to wait for the dough to rise without forcing it, how to know when something was ready without looking at the clock. He spoke of patience, of resilience, of giving without debt, and each time he handed a loaf to a child, he remembered what it meant to be handed one himself. The oven became more than a place. It became a rhythm, a center, a place where grief did not need to be named and joy did not need to be announced. People came to leave things as often as they came to take. Notes tucked beneath stones, paintings hung from branches, a quilt stitched with names of the children who had once been fed, and always, always, a pine cone placed at the edge of the oven, dry and whole, as though nature itself had entered into the ritual. Ivan grew older, his beard grayed, his hands roughened. He built more ovens in more places, some in cities, some in forests, some behind schools and inside shelters. But he always returned to the one beneath the pine, the first one, the one that felt like her hand still guided the flame. He never called it foundation, never gave it a name. He refused to turn memory into enterprise. Instead, he called it what it was, a promise kept. He told her story when asked, but never the whole of it. He left room for wonder, for interpretation, for the listener to find themselves in the pauses. He spoke of a woman who baked bread before sunrise, who never asked questions, who once stitched together blankets from flour sacks and turned silence into sanctuary. He spoke of how love sometimes arrives not as thunder, but as a loaf left quietly on a windowsill, wrapped in cloth and waiting for hands too cold to knock. Years passed, and the children who came to the oven grew and brought their own. They taught them how to knead, how to wait, how to place pine cones at the foot of the stone oven, and know it meant something. And in time, when Ivan's steps grew slower and his voice thinner with age, he taught one of them to light the fire without him, a girl with dark eyes and a laugh that reminded him of the bakery's old broom sweeper. He handed her the flint, placed her hands on the kindling and said, "Don't rush it, let it speak to you." She nodded as if she already knew. He lived to see a new oven built near the ruins of the old bakery, not to replace it, but to honor it. It stood beside the alley where children had once lined up for bread without names. The stone still bore the marks of her hands, though no one could see them but him. In the final years of his life, Ivan wrote one letter and only one. He placed it inside a hollow in the pine tree above her grave, wrapped in oil paper and sealed with wax. No one ever read it. No one needed to. But it was said that the wind carried something different through the orchard after that. A kind of hush, not of absence, but of continuation. And so her story remained, not bound in books or carved in monuments, but in the act repeated by those who remembered. A hand offering bread to another, a pine cone left without explanation, an oven lit before the dawn to greet a child with nothing but a name, and a hunger they did not yet know how to speak. Mara's life did not end with her death. It unfurled, quietly and insistently, through generations shaped by the warmth she once offered freely, one crust at a time. Her legacy was not a place, not even the oven beneath the tree. It was the understanding that to give without demand is to live beyond yourself, and to be remembered without fame is the purest kind of immortality. And so each year, when the frost begins to creep across the fields and the first winds of winter arrive without warning, someone, young or old, known or nameless, walks the hill before sunrise and leaves a pine cone on the windowsill of the farmhouse. Always dry, always whole, always warm from the pocket of someone who remembers.